She didn't knock. She didn't ask. She just climbed over my fence and tried to control a herd she didn't understand. Karen thought my reindeer would move like sheep, but she forgot one thing. The alpha male, my lead bull reindeer, doesn't follow commands from strangers, especially not ones waving flags and shouting at his herd. So when she jabbed toward him, tried to drive him like a dog, he made a decision. Yukon lowered his antlers, and he ran. Not to harm, but to warn, to defend, to draw a line no HOA ever had the right to cross. She screamed, she slipped, and the ground itself seemed to say enough. And the whole thing, every second of it, was caught on camera. Of a fence, a herd, and the moment a HOA bully learned what boundaries really mean. You wouldn't expect to find true peace on the ragged edge of a suburb. Most people believe you have to flee to the city to escape the noise of modern life. But for me, it was the opposite, the deep, cold hush of a pine-lined forest that pressed right up against the polished sidewalks and identical rooftops of Willow Creek's HOA district. My 5-acre parcel lay just beyond their glossy boundary, where manicured lawns surrendered to thick, untamed woods that refused to apologize for existing. After 20 years in the Army, 2 combat tours, too many sleepless nights, and scars both visible and hidden, all I craved was silence. My daughter Sarah and I had moved here 3 years earlier, shortly after her mother slipped away. Cancer doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about medal's rank or the battles you've survived. I couldn't save my wife, but I could build something lasting for Sarah. Something simple. Something rooted in the earth. That's how the reindeer entered our lives. It began with one. His name was Ash, a big gray-coated bull with an old scar running jagged across his flank, rescued from a bankrupt petting zoo north of Missoula. The vet warned he'd never be suitable for tourist photos or holiday parades. Too rough around the edges, too slow to trust crowds. But the moment Sarah knelt beside him under the pines, brushing snow from his thick winter coat, while he chewed hay with deliberate calm, something shifted in both of us. His dark eyes blinked slowly as if he'd seen his own share of loss and decided forgiveness was easier than resentment. Sarah laughed for the first time in months that afternoon, a sound like wind chimes after a storm. Soon 1 became 4, then 8. Now we have 12, a quiet, steady herd that moves across the snow like ghosts. They aren't pets in the usual sense. They're companions. Therapy wrapped in fur and antler. Each dawn and dusk, I walk the same paths to feed them, mend fences, clean stalls, and check gates. The rhythm of it, the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the soft huff of their breath in the cold air, the way they gather close when the wind rises, has become the heartbeat I lost somewhere overseas. My land is zoned agricultural. Livestock is not only permitted, it's protected by state law. The HOA's covenants stop at the survey pins along our shared border. Their authority ends where my property begins. Still, borders are never just lines on paper in places like Willow Creek. At first, the neighbors were curious rather than hostile. A few waved as I drove past on the ATV, with hay bales stacked high. Children pressed their faces to the fence slats, wide-eyed at the sight of real reindeer outside of Christmas cards. I didn't mind the attention. I even nailed a small cedar sign to a post near the public trail. Yes, they're real. Please don't feed them, thank you. But then came the silver Lexus that always slowed to a crawl along the eastern fence line. The woman behind the wheel wore oversized sunglasses. Even on cloudy days, her blonde hair pulled into a severe ponytail that somehow looked both expensive and angry. She moved into one of the new builds on Larkspur Lane, Phase 2 of the development, where the houses sat shoulder to shoulder with brick mailboxes and zero lot lines, every roof line and shutter color pre-approved for maximum resale value and minimum personality. 2 weeks after the Lexus first appeared, the initial letter arrived. It wasn't addressed to me by name, just a generic resident notice from the Willow Creek HOA board, expressing growing concerns regarding non-compliant livestock behavior and its impact on neighborhood tranquility. I read it once, folded it neatly, and used it to start the wood stove that evening. The HOA had no jurisdiction here, and I had no intention of pretending otherwise. The second letter came certified, mail thick cream-colored envelope, return address embossed in gold. This one demanded proper animal containment and complained about fencing that disturbs community aesthetics. My fence 8-foot cedar slats reinforced with tension wire, double-gated padlocked, and inspected by the county, was fully permitted. I'd poured the post footings myself back when Sarah was still learning to swing a hammer without hitting her thumb. The letters kept coming, each one a little sharper, a little more entitled. Then came the visits. The first was a woman in a crisp red blazer clutching a clipboard like a shield. She marched up my gravel driveway while I was splitting firewood axe mid-swing. "Mr. Callahan," she asked, voice syrupy but eyes hard. "That's me. I'm Sharon, vice president of the Willow Creek HOA. We've received several complaints about your animals." "They're reindeer," I said, letting the axe head rest on the chopping block. "Of course," she replied with a smile so thin it could slice paper. "It's simply that some residents worry about safety, especially with children nearby. Large animals can be so unpredictable." I pointed past her shoulder to the fence line 30 yards away. "They're fully enclosed. This is private property. We're only trying to maintain harmony," she pressed, undeterred. "As a veteran, I'm sure you appreciate the value of order and discipline." I didn't answer. I just lifted another log, set it upright, and brought the axe down with a clean, resounding crack that echoed through the cold air. That night, I told Sarah to avoid engaging anyone wearing an HOA lanyard or carrying a clipboard. At 15, she was already sharper than most adults I knew, quick-witted and fiercely protective of the life we'd carved out here. "They're afraid of anything they can't control," she said, brushing hay from her jacket. I chuckled, the sound low and tired. "Your mom used to say the exact same thing." "Or you," she shot back with a half-smile that hurt in the best way. We both felt the shift coming. According to the retired teacher who jogged past every morning and loved sharing gossip, the woman from Larkspur Lane had begun attending board meetings. Her name, I learned, was Karen Langford. And Karen Langford had never once spoken to me directly. But I'd seen her watching. Always watching. The binoculars came next. I first spotted them on a crisp October morning when the aspens were bleeding gold into the underbrush. A glint of sunlight flashed off glass from the direction of Larkspur Lane. There she stood, Karen Langford, on her elevated back deck, elbows propped on the railing lenses, trained directly on my eastern paddock. Yukon was grazing near the fence that day, his massive rack casting long shadows across the frost. She didn't even bother to hide when I looked up. Sarah saw it too. "She's been out there for 20 minutes, she whispered from the kitchen window, hot chocolate steaming in her hands, like we're some kind of zoo exhibit. I didn't respond right away. I just watched the woman watching us, feeling that old familiar tightening in my chest, the same one I used to get before a patrol. Not fear. Readiness. Over the following weeks, the surveillance became routine. The silver Lexus would cruise past at the same times, 7:15 a.m., just after I started morning feeding. 3:45 p.m. When Sarah got home from school, and again around dusk, headlights off, even though the sky had already dimmed. Sometimes she parked just beyond the boundary, engine idling, phone held high. Other times she brought company clusters of HOA loyalists in Patagonia vests who gathered at the fence line like birdwatchers at a rare sighting. One afternoon, I caught her leading a small delegation, 4 women, and one nervous-looking man, all clutching printed packets. They stood in a semicircle, pointing and gesturing toward the herd as if assessing a public health risk. I was repairing a section of wire near the gate and made no effort to approach. Let them look. The reindeer paid them no mind, continuing their slow, deliberate grazing while steam rose from their nostrils in the chill air. That evening, another certified envelope arrived. This one contained photographs, grainy prints taken through the fence slats, along with a formal complaint about offensive odors drifting into residential areas and excessive noise during early morning hours. The smell apparently was hay and pine needles. The noise was the soft thud of hooves on frozen ground and the occasional low grunt of contentment from the herd. Sarah read it aloud in the kitchen, her voice dripping with disbelief. "They're complaining about reindeer breathing." I took the pages from her, scanned the signatures at the bottom, Sharon's looping cursive prominent among them, and added them to the growing folder I kept in the locked drawer of my desk. The next escalation came on a Saturday when the wind was sharp enough to cut through Carhartt. I was in the barn stacking bales when Sarah burst through the side door, cheeks flushed. "Dad, there's a guy at the gate, says he's from animal control." I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked out to meet him. Young fellow, early 20s, county truck parked at an angle, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. His name tag read, Victor. Afternoon, sir. He started clipboard held like a flimsy shield. Got a report of potentially aggressive livestock near a residential boundary. I invited him to walk the perimeter with me. He hesitated, then followed. The reindeer watched us with mild curiosity as we moved along the fence. Yukon stood closest ears forward, but body relaxed, his breath forming slow clouds in the air. Victor took notes, checked the height and strength of the posts, examined the double gates. Everything looks solid, he admitted when we finished the loop. Better containment than most places I visit, honestly. He handed me his card. Off the record. Put up some signs with code citations. People like the ones calling this in, they back off when they see legal language they don't understand. I thanked him and he left without issuing a single citation. That night I ordered laminated signs online. Private property. Criminal trespass prohibited. MCOR 456203. Livestock protected under state law 811101. Active surveillance. I posted them every 50 feet along the shared boundary, bright white letters on black background impossible to miss. Karen did not appreciate the new decor. The following Sunday she appeared in person for the first time. Full winter armor ivory parka designer boots that had clearly never seen mud phone already recording as she marched to the fence line, directly opposite the new signs. She jabbed a manicured finger toward the nearest placard, then toward Yukon, then toward me as I watched from the porch. I couldn't hear her words over the wind, but the body language was unmistakable outrage, entitlement, threat. Yukon took one deliberate step forward. Not a charge, just presence. Shoulder-squared antlers catching the weak sunlight like polished bone. Karen stumbled back half a step, phone dipping. She recovered quickly, spun on her heel, and stormed to her Lexus. Sarah stood beside me on the porch, arms crossed tight. She's not going to stop, is she? No, I said quietly, but neither are we. That night, I pulled footage from the new motion-activated cameras I'd installed along the fence. Crystal clear Karen Langford, face twisted in fury, yelling something the microphone couldn't quite catch. I saved the clip in a folder titled Evidence, Escalation 1. Because I knew with the certainty of someone who'd seen conflicts spiral in far worse places than a Montana suburb that this was only the beginning. The HOA newsletter arrived a week later, slipped into our mailbox, despite the fact that we weren't members. Front page headline in bold, Community Livability Survey. It read like a polite poll until you reached the buried questions about bordering property uses, proximity of large animals to shared greenbelts, and potential new ordinances for neighborhood harmony. They weren't asking for opinions. They were building a case. I drove to City Hall the next morning. Dean Michaels, the zoning officer I'd dealt with during fence permitting, greeted me with a tired but genuine smile. They've been blowing up my inbox, he admitted, leaning back in his chair. But your parcel's agricultural zoning is ironclad. Grandfathered in before the HOA even existed. They can complain all they want, nothing changes that. I exhaled tension, easing just a fraction. But people like the woman from Larkspur Lane don't accept no gracefully. They find new doors to kick. And sure enough, 3 days later, Victor returned this time with a senior officer named Linda. Another welfare check, another walk around the paddock. Another clean report. Yet every time they left, I could feel the pressure building like storm clouds stacking against the mountains. Sarah started wearing my old body cam on her jacket when she did evening chores. Not because she feared the reindeer, she trusted them completely, but because we no longer trusted the eyes watching from the other side. Winter deepened. Snow piled against the fence posts. The herd grew thicker coats, moving slower, more deliberate. And across the boundary, the silver Lexus kept appearing headlights cutting through the dark like searchlights. Karen Langford had declared war without ever saying a word to my face. But I'd heard her loud and clear. The pressure kept building slow and relentless, like snow accumulating on a weak branch. I doubled down on security. 3 new high-resolution cameras with night vision and motion alerts joined the originals angled to cover every vulnerable stretch of the boundary. I added floodlights that snapped on like interrogation beams whenever something larger than a coyote crossed their path. Trail cams disappeared into the brush on my side of the line lenses, hidden behind bark and pine needles. Every evening I downloaded the footage, time-stamped it, and backed it up to an external drive locked in the gun safe. Sarah helped without being asked. She learned to check the SD cards, label the files, and note anything unusual. "Look at this," she said one night, pointing to the screen. A grainy figure in a pale coat moved along the green belt just after midnight, pausing at the fence flashlight beam sweeping across the paddock. The face was obscured by a hood, but the build and the way she held herself, shoulders back, chin high, was unmistakable. The woman from Larkspur Lane was no longer content with daylight surveillance. A few days later, two men in county-style windbreakers arrived in a white SUV bearing a zoning authority emblem I didn't recognize. They climbed out with clipboards and a phone already recording. Mr. Callahan, the taller one, called. "We're conducting a courtesy inspection of your livestock facilities. The HOA has raised concerns about possible code violations." I stepped off the porch, gloves still on from morning chores, Yukon watching from the paddock with ears pricked forward. "You have a court order or a warrant?" I asked. The man with the clipboard blinked. "This is just an informal review." "Then it's trespassing," I said evenly. "My zoning is agricultural, fully permitted, and exempt from HOA oversight. You want inside my fence line? Bring a judge's signature or a sheriff, otherwise turn around." They exchanged uneasy glances. The second man lowered his phone. Within minutes, they were back in the SUV, tires spitting gravel as they headed toward the east gate, the one closest to Larkspur Lane. That same afternoon, I found fresh boot prints in the snow behind the hay shed. The trail started in the HOA greenbelt, crossed the boundary, and stopped just short of the paddock corner. A scrap of pale fabric fluttered from a nail on the fence post, expensive beige, unmistakably from a designer coat. I left the fabric exactly where it was, photographed it from multiple angles, and added the images to the evidence folder. Sarah's eyes had grown harder over the weeks. "They're planning something bigger," she said quietly, as we reviewed the latest footage together. "She's not going to quit until she forces us out." I couldn't argue. That night, I emailed the entire growing archive. Photos, videos, letters, license plates to James Calder, the rancher turned attorney, whose card I'd kept since a county fair years earlier. His reply came before dawn. "You've got more than enough for a cease and desist. If they cross the line again, we go for injunctive relief. Keep documenting." The HOA responded to the silence with louder noise. Flyers appeared on community bulletin boards, bold red warnings about dangerous wild animals near residential homes, and advice to keep children away from the greenbelt until the issue is resolved. A kind neighbor, Marcia, who used to bring Sarah homemade cookies, stopped by one evening looking stricken. "I signed their petition," she confessed. "They said it was only about noise. I didn't know they were talking about your reindeer. I'm so sorry." I told her not to worry, but the sting lingered. Lies spread faster than truth in places where people preferred tidy lawns to complicated realities. Then came the newsletter that finally pushed me past patience. Front page, full-color wild animal breeder operating on Willow Creek border. HOA takes action. The article was a masterpiece of half-truths, claims of ungated livestock, aggressive behavior, and threats to children and pets. They even ran a zoomed-in photo of Yukon, taken without permission, his antlers filling the frame, captioned, "Unpredictable male animal." Sarah read it aloud, in a voice trembling with fury. "They're calling him unpredictable. He's the calmest creature on this property." I printed every page, highlighted the lies in yellow, and drove straight to James Calder's office. By evening, he had drafted a defamation and harassment notice, certified mail return receipt requested. We didn't stop there. Sarah and I added more cameras, 12 in total, now covering every angle. I installed trail spikes in the brush, approaches, short metal stubs, angled to puncture boots but not hooves. New signs went up quoting specific Montana codes on criminal trespass and surveillance tampering. I even mounted a small speaker that played a recorded warning. "You are on private property. Leave immediately, or law enforcement will be notified," triggered by the same motion sensors that lit the floods. Yukon sensed the change in us. The guardian bull grew restless, patrolling the fence line more often, pausing to stare toward the greenbelt whenever headlights swept past. His breath steamed in the freezing air like silent challenges. One evening, Sarah found fresh handprints on the lower rail of the east fence, gloved fingers pressed into the frost just below a no trespassing sign. Someone had leaned there, maybe tried to climb. She photographed them, then wiped the prints away with a gloved hand of her own. "They're testing us," she said, voice steady but eyes bright with anger. "Seeing how far they can push before we break." I pulled her into a quick, fierce hug. "We don't break, kiddo. We hold." But inside, the old soldier in me was preparing for the moment when holding the line would no longer be enough. Because the woman from Larkspur Lane had moved beyond complaints and newsletters. She was gathering tools for something far more dangerous. And the herd Yukon, most of all, was watching her right back. The first real breach came on a gray Tuesday in mid-January, when the sky hung low and heavy, threatening more snow. I'd driven into town for feed and barn repairs, leaving Sarah home with online classes. At 2:17 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text that stopped my heart. "Someone's in the paddock. I think it's her. She's got a man with her." I called instantly. Sarah's voice was a whisper against the window glass. They slipped through the side gate somehow. They're clapping and whistling, trying to make the reindeer move toward them. "Stay inside," I ordered, voice calm, out of habit, even as adrenaline flooded my veins. Doors locked. Film from the upstairs window. "I'm coming." I broke every speed limit on the way home, tires sliding on patches of ice, the truck's engine roaring like it understood the urgency. By the time I skidded into the driveway, the intruders were gone. But the evidence of their arrogance was everywhere. The herd was scattered and agitated heads, high ears twitching. Ash limped slightly one flank, scraped raw against a corner brace in his panic. Worst of all, the heavy 6x6 gate post on the east paddock lay splintered near the base, snapped clean by Yukon's raw power when he'd surged forward. Sarah met me at the door, pale but steady, phone still in her hand. "I got it all," she said. From the bedroom window, clear faces. We sat at the kitchen table and watched the footage together. The video was steady despite her shaking hands. The woman from Larkspur Lane, Karen Langford, in her signature ivory coat, marching across my snow-covered pasture as if she owned it. Beside her, an older man with thinning gray hair and a nervous hunch holding a long lead rope coiled like a threat. Karen clapped sharply, whistled piercingly, and shouted commands. "Move. Come on, move," as though the reindeer were disobedient dogs. The man waved his arms, trying to funnel the herd toward the open gate. The reindeer bunched together, confused and frightened. Ash bolted first, then the others scattered. Yukon stood his ground in the center, massive frame, planted like an ancient sentinel. His ears flattened, his head lowered. The great spread of his antlers caught the weak winter light. Karen, emboldened by her own delusion, stepped closer and jabbed the air with her gloved hand. That was the moment the guardian bull decided he'd had enough. He stamped once hard, the impact sending a puff of snow into the air. Then again. A low rumble escaped his chest, more felt than heard. And then he charged. Not a blind, wild rush. A controlled, thunderous advance. 3 powerful strides that closed the distance in seconds. Karen's bravado shattered. She shrieked, stumbled backward, and fell hard into a drift. The man dropped the rope and scrambled after her. Together they flailed through the deep snow, slipping and cursing, until they vanished through the gate they'd forced open. Yukon halted inches from where Karen had fallen. He reared once, front hooves slashing the air, then slammed them down with a crack that echoed across the property like a gunshot. Snow exploded outward in a white burst. He snorted steam billowing from his nostrils, then turned deliberately and walked back to the herd. The entire incident lasted less than 2 minutes, but it changed everything. I checked the trail cameras immediately. One had captured the entry perfectly, Karen picking the simple latch with a tool, the man holding the gate wide. Another recorded their panicked exit, Karen's coat streaked with mud, face twisted in terror. Sarah watched the replay in silence, then looked up at me. She thought she could just take them. She thought wrong, I said. The police arrived 40 minutes later, Deputy Rames, a no-nonsense veteran, who'd responded to my earlier reports. I handed him my laptop. We watched the compiled footage together on the porch, breath fogging in the cold. He whistled low when Yukon reared. "That bull's got more restraint than most people I know. She's damn lucky." "She trespassed," I said. "Forced entry, endangered my livestock, tried to steal them for all I know." Rames nodded slowly. "You want to press charges?" "Every single one I can," I replied. He took statements from both Sarah and me, photographed the broken post, and Ash's injury, collected the trail cam memory cards as evidence. Before leaving, he glanced toward the HOA side of the fence. "Off the record, people like that don't learn until consequences hit hard. You've got the proof. Use it." That evening, the HOA sent an email not from Karen, but from their legal representative. It claimed the incident had been a misunderstood community outreach effort, and that any entry onto my property was unintentional. I didn't dignify it with a response. Instead, I forwarded every file, videos, photos, police report number to James Calder. He called the next morning, voice calm, but edged with steel. This isn't harassment anymore. It's criminal trespass, reckless endangerment, attempted theft of livestock. We've got them cold. I'm filing for an emergency restraining order today, and we'll prepare civil claims. You've held the line perfectly, now we push back. I hung up and walked out to the paddock as the sun set behind the pines, painting the snow in bruised purples and golds. The herd had calmed, gathering near the hay rack. Yukon approached, slowly lowered his great head, and nudged my shoulder with surprising gentleness. I rested my hand on the warm curve of his neck. You protected your home today, old friend. He exhaled a long, steaming breath, eyes half closed in the fading light. Across the fence, the green belt lay silent. No Lexus, no binoculars, no prying eyes. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter. But I knew better than to trust the quiet. Karen Langford had finally shown her hand. And the herd, especially the towering alpha, had shown her exactly what waited on the other side of that line. The quiet after the breach didn't last long. It never does when someone like Karen Langford is involved. Within days, the HOA launched a new wave of attacks, subtler at first disguised as concern, but no less calculated. A dead squirrel appeared one morning, tossed over the eastern fence into the paddock. Its neck was cleanly broken, body still limp and fresh. The reindeer wouldn't touch it. They grazed around the small corpse as if it were toxic. Yukon sniffed once, then turned away with a dismissive snort. I knew immediately this wasn't the work of a fox or hawk. The herd doesn't hunt. This was staged, a crude attempt to manufacture evidence of aggressive animals. I gloved up, bagged the carcass, photographed it from every angle, with timestamp visible, and added it to the evidence drive. That same night, around 3:00 a.m., a motion alert pinged on my phone. I pulled up the feed in the dark, heart already racing. A hooded figure moved along the boundary in the greenbelt, paused at the fence, and hurled something small over the top before melting back into the shadows. The gait, the height, the angry economy of movement. It was her. I filed another police report the next day. Deputy Rames took the footage, shook his head. We're building a file, but until she puts boots on your soil again, options are limited. I understood the law. I didn't have to like it. So I went back to preparation. I pulled an old steel lockbox from the closet, the one I hadn't touched since leaving the Army. Inside were topographic maps of the property I'd sketched years ago. Drainage patterns, wind directions, blind spots. There was also a section I'd labeled Security Response, Human Interference, contingency plans for threats I'd hoped never to need. Sarah found me studying them one evening in the barn lantern light flickering across the pages. You think she'll try again? She asked, voice small but steady. I think she's desperate now, I said. Desperate people do stupid things. We started exercising Yukon closer to the problematic fence line, not as provocation, but as presence. I'd lead him on a long halter while Sarah walked beside us, brushing snow from his coat. He moved like living sculpture, 500 pounds of muscle and bone antlers, spanning wider than a man's outstretched arms, hooves striking the frozen ground in a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed across the paddocks. The sound carried. The sight commanded attention. From her deck, Karen watched every session, phone in hand, recording furiously. Her posture grew more rigid each day, like a spring winding tighter. Animal control returned twice more that month. Once it was Victor again, apologetic and quick. The second time it was Linda, the senior officer, who walked the perimeter with a practiced eye. Everything's in order, she said when we finished. Healthier herd than most ranches I visit. She paused, glancing toward the HOA homes. Off the record, Mr. Callahan, someone's pushing hard to find anything they can pin on you. Real hard. I nodded. I know who. She didn't confirm it, but the look she gave me said enough. Then came the night that crossed a new line. At 11:42 p.m., the trail cam deep in the greenbelt triggered. I watched live as two figures emerged from the shadows near Karen's property line. She wore dark clothes, now no ivory coat, to give her away, and gloves. Beside her walked a taller woman, blonde, mid-40s, face unfamiliar. They carried a long metal pole between them, the kind used to prod cattle. They stopped at the fence, whispered, pointed toward the sleeping herd. Yukon lifted his head from the shelter, ears swiveling. He didn't approach, just stood, watch breath fogging silver in the moonlight. Without warning, Karen reached through the slats and tossed several bright red objects over the wire. Apples. I was already pulling on boots as the feed cut to static. I sprinted outside with a flashlight heart hammering. Yukon was sniffing the snow where the apples had landed. I snatched them up before he could bite 1, 2, 3, 4, shoved them into a plastic bag and sealed it. The next morning, I drove them straight to the agricultural vet in town. 3 days later, the lab report came back. The apples had been laced with a low-dose sedative veterinary grade, enough to disorient a large animal. Slow reaction times impair motor control. Not immediately lethal, but if Yukon had eaten more than 1 or 2, he could have staggered, collapsed, appeared aggressive or unstable to anyone watching. Perfect for a staged incident. I sat in the vet's office reading the results twice, rage cold and precise in my gut. That afternoon, I called James Calder. "We're done with warnings," I said. "I want a full restraining order against Karen Langford, and I want criminal charges filed attempted animal endangerment, poisoning livestock." "You've got ironclad proof," he replied. "Camera's chain of custody on the apples lab results. I'll have paperwork moving by end of day." I hung up and walked out to the paddock. The herd was grazing calmly under a weak February sun. Yukon ambled over when he saw me, lowered his head for a scratch behind the ears. Sarah joined us, adjusting a new camera mount on the fence post. "She tried to drug him," I told her quietly. Sarah's hand stilled on the lens. Her eyes filled, but her jaw set hard. "She won't get another chance," she said. We stood there together, father, daughter, and the towering stag, watching the tree line where trouble always seemed to gather. The air smelled of pine and coming snow. And for the first time, I felt the balance tipping. Karen Langford had run out of safe moves. The next time she came close, she wouldn't face warnings or cameras. She'd face consequences. The morning of the final confrontation dawned under a flat, oppressive sky, the kind that presses down on the world and makes every sound feel muffled, every breath heavier. Sarah had gone into town early to help a friend shovel driveways for extra cash. I was alone on the property, repairing the southern gatepost that had begun to lean under weeks of wind and ice. The herd grazed quietly in the main paddock, steam rising from their backs like gentle smoke signals. Yukon stood apart from the others, motionless, near the center of the field. His ears were pricked forward, body alert, in a way that raised the hairs on my neck. I paused mid-swing with the post driver and followed his gaze. A sharp, unnatural whistle cut through the still air, then another, followed by shouts commanding impatient, edged with false authority. I dropped the tool and ran. Rounding the barn at a sprint, I came into full view of the eastern paddock and stopped dead. The gate hung wide open. Karen Langford was inside my fence boots, sinking deep in snow, navy parka zipped to her chin. A long herding pole gripped in both hands, with a bright plastic flag snapping at the end. Beside her, holding the gate like a cowardly accomplice, stood the tall blonde woman from the Poisoned Apple Night. Karen clapped her hands explosively and whistled again, stomping forward. "Go on, move, get moving," she shouted at the herd, swinging the pole in wide arcs, as if the reindeer were cattle to be driven to market. The animals scattered in confusion and fear, hooves churning snow into frantic clouds. Ash bolted toward the shelter. The younger ones bunched together, heads high, eyes rolling white. Yukon did not run. He planted himself between the herd and the intruder's shoulder-squared antlers, lowered just enough to cast a shadow like judgment across the snow. "Hey," I roared, voice tearing across the field. "Get off my land!" Karen didn't even glance my way. Her face was flushed crimson with exertion and triumph, eyes wild. She jabbed the flag toward Yukon's face, inches from his muzzle. The guardian bull had endured enough. He stamped once hard, the impact reverberating through the frozen ground like distant thunder. Snow exploded around his hooves. A low rumbling bellow escaped his chest, deeper than any sound I'd ever heard from him. Then he charged. Full unstoppable power unleashed in a storm of muscle and antler. 500 pounds of righteous fury thundering straight at her. Karen's bravado shattered like thin ice. The scream that ripped from her throat was primal raw terror stripped of every layer of pretense. She spun stumbled arms, windmilling as her boots slipped on packed snow. The herding pole flew from her hands. She crashed backward into a drift white parka, splaying open legs, kicking helplessly. Yukon skidded to a halt, mere inches from her fallen body. He reared high, front legs, slashing the air antlers, sweeping a deadly arc, then slammed his hooves down with a crack that shook snow from nearby branches. The message was unmistakable. This is the line. You do not cross it again." Karen scrambled backward on all fours, sobbing now, face streaked with tears and melted snow. "Stop, stop, help me," she wailed, voice cracking. The blonde accomplice slammed the gate shut and fled toward the greenbelt, disappearing into the trees without a backward glance. I vaulted the side fence and sprinted across the paddock, sliding the inner gate open, just as Yukon turned away with deliberate calm, snorting once before rejoining the herd. I towered over Karen, where she sat trembling in the snow, soaked through designer coat, ruined entitlement, finally stripped bare. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded, voice low and dangerous. She looked up at me, hatred warring with terror in her eyes. They don't belong here," she stammered. "They're dangerous. I was moving them for the children, for safety." "You opened my gate," I cut in. "You trespassed. You provoked a 500-pound bull. You could have been killed. My animals could have been injured or lost." I pointed toward the open gate swinging in the wind. "That's not safety. That's felony stupidity." Her mouth opened closed. No words came. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and flipped the camera to record. "I suggest you crawl back to your side of the fence. Police are already on their way." They were. Sarah's automated alert system motion sensors, tied to the gate latch, had triggered the moment it was forced. Silent alarms had gone to both our phones and directly to the sheriff's substation. Deputy Rames arrived 10 minutes later, lights flashing across the snow. Karen had managed to drag herself to the boundary by then leaning against her Lexus, parked just beyond the greenbelt face, blotchy, refusing to speak. I handed over the compiled footage, 3 perfect angles from the newest cameras, plus audio clear enough to capture every whistle, every shout, every terrified scream. Rames watched the charge sequence twice on my tablet, expression grim. "She's lucky that bull has better manners than she does," he muttered. "She tried to hurt him with a flag," I said. He stared at me. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." He radioed for backup, then turned to me. "Felony criminal trespass. Reckless endangerment of persons and livestock. You pressing every charge." "Every single one," I confirmed. Karen began to cry as the deputy approached her, not the calculated tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the broken sobs of a person who finally understood the cliff she'd walked off. Inside the barn later, Sarah, home by then, brushed burrs and snow from Yukon's thick neck fur, while he stood patient and still. The herd had settled, the adrenaline fading into wary calm. Sarah's voice was quiet but fierce. She crossed the line for good this time. "She did," I said, leaning against the stall post, letting out a breath I'd been holding for months. And now the line crosses back. Because this had never been just about Reindeer. It had been about a woman who believed rules were for other people, boundaries were suggestions, and power came from making others bend. Karen Langford had finally met something that refused to yield. And in the cold Montana silence that followed, the sound of antlers holding firm echoed louder than any scream. The video spread like wildfire on dry pine needles. Sarah had edited the footage that same evening, 3 clean angles, synchronized timestamps, visible audio, crisp enough to capture every whistle, every panicked scream, and the thunder of Yukon's hooves. She uploaded a shortened version to her private channel, mostly for friends, and a couple of local groups, but one friend shared it to a Facebook page called HOA Nightmares of Montana, and from there, it exploded. By midnight, it had 10,000 views. By morning, 500,000. Within a week, the clip had raced across TikTok, Reddit, YouTube compilations. Everywhere people gathered to watch entitled behavior meet unstoppable consequences. The thumbnail alone was devastating. Yukon mid-charge antlers filling the frame like a crown of judgment, Karen's white and navy figure splayed in the snow, mouth open in a silent scream. The title Sarah chose was simple and perfect. HOA, Karen tries to herd reindeer, bull has other plans. Memes followed within hours. Reaction videos, stitches, duets. Late-night hosts mentioned it in monologues. My phone buzzed constantly, reporters, podcast hosts, even a producer from a national morning show wanting an interview. Local news vans parked near the public trailhead, hoping for paddock shots or a statement. I gave none, but the sheriff's office called 2 days later with news I'd been waiting for. Karen Langford is being formally charged, the deputy told me. Criminal trespass, reckless endangerment, and a couple of livestock-specific counts. The county attorney's office is also opening an investigation into the HOA board for potential conspiracy to violate agricultural land protections. James Calder had wasted no time. The moment charges were filed, he'd forwarded our entire archive, every letter, every camera clip, every ignored cease and desist straight to the prosecutor. They took one look at the pattern of harassment and decided this wasn't just one woman's obsession. It was organized overreach. The HOA board panicked. They called an emergency meeting and for the first time extended an invitation to me not as a defendant, but as a witness. I showed up in my cleanest flannel shirt, broken-in boots, still carrying faint barn smells, Yukon's calm presence in my mind as I walked into the Willow Creek Community Center. The room was sterile beige walls, folding chairs that squeaked under nervous weight, fluorescent lights humming overhead like anxious insects. About 30 residents filled the back rows, clutching old newsletters like talismans. Up front, the board sat behind a long table. Everett, the balding president with the permanent frown and twitching left eye, cleared his throat repeatedly. Karen's chair, the one marked vice chair, was empty. A crooked name placard sat in front of it like an abandoned throne. Mr. Callahan Everett, began voice thin, thank you for coming. The board wishes to express profound regret over recent events and acknowledge that Ms. Langford's actions escalated far beyond acceptable bounds. I stood in the aisle, arms loose at my sides, and waited. We were not aware, he continued, that she had entered your property that day. We do not condone. You signed the authorization for her to investigate my land, I said, voice level but carrying to the back row. I have the minutes. Your signature is right there. Color drained from his face. Around the table, board members shifted, eyes darting anywhere but at me. A few residents in the audience murmured. I'm not here for apologies, I went on. I'm here so you understand what you tried to do. You weaponized your positions to wage a private war on land that was never yours to control. You trespassed. You lied. You endangered my daughter and my animals. Everett opened his mouth. I raised a hand and he closed it again. You didn't break me, I said. You activated me. The room went utterly still. Going forward, I continued, I expect a full retraction in the next newsletter, printed prominent and unambiguous. I expect every surveillance photo or video taken by HOA members of my property to be deleted with verification. And I expect a written admission to the County Zoning Commission that you attempted to influence land use outside your jurisdiction, a violation of state law. A woman near the back, arms crossed, spoke up. Or what? Then I file civil suits for defamation, harassment, and damages, I answered. I bring every frame of video, every email, every police report to open court. And I will win. Everett swallowed hard. We'll take your requests under advisement. You'll do more than that, I said. You'll cooperate fully with the county investigation. Because if you don't, the next meeting won't be in this beige box. It'll be in a courtroom. One by one, heads around the table nodded, slow, reluctant, but unmistakable. As I turned to leave, several residents approached. I didn't know they were doing half this stuff, an older man muttered. Karen scared most of us into going along, a woman admitted. She kept saying you were planning some kind of commercial reindeer operation, Christmas events, petting zoo traffic nightmare. I just shook my head and walked out into the cold night air. 3 days later, the retraction arrived, embossed letterhead, formal language mailed to every address in Willow Creek. The Willow Creek HOA board acknowledges that certain actions regarding the Callahan property exceeded our jurisdictional authority and were not in compliance with state law. We deeply regret the distress caused to Mr. Callahan and his family, and affirm the fully legal status of his agricultural land use and livestock. They even included a fruit basket. I donated it to the vet clinic, but the real fallout was just beginning. Karen's name disappeared from board documents. Her column vanished from the newsletter. Residents who once orbited her approval now kept their distance. And across the fence, for the first time in years, the greenbelt stayed empty at dusk. No silver Lexus, no binoculars, no whispered plots, just snow settling softly on pine branches, and the quiet knowledge that some lines once defended are never crossed again. The HOA's carefully constructed facade cracked wide open the day the whistleblower stepped forward. Her name was Denise Tran, a soft-spoken accountant in her 50s who had lived quietly in Willow Creek for over a decade. I'd only ever exchanged polite nods with her at the farmer's market, where she bought Sarah's occasional batches of homemade reindeer horn crafts. But behind those quiet eyes, Denise had been watching the board's slow descent into obsession. One gray March morning, a thick envelope arrived in James Calder's office. Inside was a 12-page letter typed, signed, and notarized. Denise laid out everything how Karen had systematically intimidated the board into approving escalating actions against us. How she'd drafted misleading newsletters and petitions. How she'd organized inspection teams and coached members on what to say if questioned. Most damning were the attachment screenshots of email chains and text threads recovered from a group chat titled Willow Creek Border Issue. In one exchange, Karen wrote to Everett, "If we can create enough documented incidents, even fabricated perception of danger, the county will have to act. Shift liability to the owner if the bull ever reacts. No one wants a wild animal next to a playground." In another, she bragged, "He's ex-military. That type always cracks under sustained pressure. Just keep the reports coming." James read the pages aloud over speakerphone while I sat in the barn, Yukon dozing in the stall behind me. When he finished, the silence stretched long enough for me to hear the wind rattling the tin roof. "This is the kill shot," James finally said. "Malicious intent, conspiracy, coordinated defamation. We're no longer defending Callahan. We're suing." He filed an amended civil complaint that same week, adding the HOA itself as a defendant and naming Everett and 2 other board members individually. Discovery demands flew emails, meeting minutes, phone records, deleted messages recovered by digital forensics. The dominoes fell fast. Everett resigned, first citing personal health reasons, in a terse email that fooled no one. 2 other board members followed within days, their statements vague and carefully lawyered. The president's chair remained empty through the spring, a silent monument to overreach. Karen's defense tried to paint her as a well-meaning citizen protecting children. But every new document peeled away another layer of that fiction. The recovered audio from a board Zoom call was particularly brutal. Karen's voice, sharp and impatient, saying, "If we can get him to lose control of that beast just once, the authorities will force him out. Call it a public safety emergency." She called Yukon a beast. She called me unstable. The judge didn't need long. In a preliminary hearing, the court granted summary judgment on several counts: defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and civil conspiracy. Damages would be determined later, but the HOA was ordered to pay interim legal fees and issue a court-mandated public apology printed in 3 consecutive newsletters, emailed to every resident, and posted permanently on their website. The apology was excruciating in its specificity. The Willow Creek Homeowners Association board admits that it knowingly participated in a campaign of harassment, false reporting, and defamation against resident Robert Callahan and his family. We acknowledge that these actions were motivated by improper attempts to influence land use outside our legal authority. We affirm that Mr. Callahan's agricultural operation and livestock are fully legal and protected. We regret the harm caused and commit to internal reforms, including mandatory training on property rights and zoning law. They were also required to fund an independent review of all past complaints against bordering properties, a review that quietly uncovered 2 other cases where the board had overstepped. Karen's criminal trial date loomed, but the civil pressure broke her first. Her attorney approached James with a settlement offer. She would pay substantial damages, accept a permanent no-contact order, and leave Willow Creek entirely if we agreed not to pursue further punitive claims. James laid the terms in front of me one evening on the porch. Sarah sat beside me, brushing Yukon's shedding winter coat, while he stood patient as stone. "What do you think?" I asked her. She didn't hesitate. "Let her go, but make sure everyone knows why." We accepted on condition that the settlement include a public acknowledgement of liability and a donation to a veteran's mental health program in Montana. Karen signed within 48 hours. By early summer, the for sale sign went up in front of the house on Larkspur Lane. I watched from the paddock as movers loaded pristine furniture into vans. Karen never emerged. Word came through the retired teacher gossip network that she'd relocated to Arizona, somewhere flat, hot, and entirely devoid of snow pine trees or reindeer. Good. The HOA limped along with a skeleton board of 3 reluctant members. A new city ordinance pushed through with testimony from Denise, James, and me sharply limited their ability to interfere with adjacent agricultural parcels. Violations now carried personal fines for board members, not just the association. One warm June evening, Sarah and I stood at the fence line, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. Fireflies began their slow dance over the pasture. Yukon grazed nearby his new summer coat, sleek and shining antlers in full velvet. "They're afraid of us now," Sarah said quietly. "No," I corrected. "They're afraid of being held accountable. That's different." She smiled the first unguarded smile I'd seen in over a year. Across the greenbelt, the houses looked smaller somehow, quieter. The Lexus was gone. The binoculars were gone. The endless watching had ended. In its place was something better, the deep, unbroken hush of a boundary finally respected. The day of Karen Langford's final reckoning arrived on a crisp spring morning when the snow had finally retreated to shadowed patches under the pines, and the ground breathed damp and alive beneath our boots. It wasn't a full criminal trial, with jury boxes and dramatic testimony, no orange jumpsuits or packed galleries. But the county courtroom carried its own weight, polished oak benches. The faint smell of lemon polish and old paper. A judge whose quiet authority filled the room more than any gavel ever could. Sarah and I sat in the front row, side by side. She wore a simple navy coat, hair pulled back, posture straight as a fence post. I wore the same clean flannel I'd worn to the HOA meeting, boots polished for the first time in years. We didn't speak much on the drive over. We didn't need to. Karen sat at the defense table, in a slate gray suit that looked expensive but ill-fitting now, as if the fabric itself had lost faith in her. Her hair was pulled into a severe knot, face pale under carefully applied makeup that couldn't quite hide the strain around her eyes. She never once looked our way. James Calder opened with the precision of a man who knew the case was already won. He walked the judge through the timeline, every letter, every trespass, every poisoned apple, every forced gate, with supporting exhibits projected on a screen. Time-stamped videos, lab reports, police files, the whistleblower emails. When the synchronized footage of Yukon's charge played, the room went utterly still. Even the court reporter's fingers paused above her keyboard. The defense attorney, a young man whose suit looked rented, tried the concerned citizen angle one last time. He argued that Karen had acted out of genuine fear for neighborhood children, that her actions were misguided but not malicious. The words fell flat, echoing awkwardly in the high ceiling. Then Sarah was called. She walked to the stand without hesitation, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the truth with a voice clear and steady. James asked gentle questions, how the constant surveillance had felt, how the breach had shaken her sense of safety, how watching someone try to drug or drive away animals that had become family had changed her. "I was never afraid of the reindeer," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the judge. "They're gentle. They're home. I was afraid of her. No matter how many times we followed the rules, locked the gates, documented everything, she just kept coming. Like our peace didn't matter." The judge leaned forward slightly. "And what would you have wanted from all this, young lady?" Sarah finally glanced toward Karen, just long enough for the woman to flinch, then back to the bench. "I wanted someone to tell her that she doesn't get to decide who belongs here, that boundaries aren't just suggestions." She stepped down, walked back to me, and slipped her hand into mine. I squeezed once, that was all. The ruling came that same afternoon. Karen Langford was found fully liable on every count: criminal trespass, reckless endangerment of persons and livestock, harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, especially toward a minor. The judge awarded damages totaling $118,000, covering our legal fees, property repairs, veterinary bills, and compensation for the months of fear and disruption. Payments were structured over 5 years, but the message was clear: consequences have weight. A permanent protective order was issued. Karen was forbidden from coming within 300 feet of our property, contacting us in any way, or possessing images or recordings of our land or animals. The HOA received its own rebuke. Though not on trial that day, the judge referred their pattern of conduct to the County Ethics Committee with a strongly worded recommendation that the current board face potential dissolution if any similar violations occurred. Karen left through a side exit, avoiding cameras and the small cluster of local reporters who'd gathered outside. I caught only a glimpse of her beside her car in the parking lot, head bowed, hands trembling as she fumbled with keys. The woman who once believed she could rearrange other people's lives like patio furniture now couldn't even open her own door without shaking. We stepped into the spring sunlight together, Sarah and I. She took a deep breath as if tasting the air for the first time in years. "Feel any different?" I asked. She smiled, small but real. "I feel like I can finally exhale." That evening, we drove home slowly, windows down, letting the scent of warming pine and thawing earth fill the truck. Yukon met us at the gate as always, pressing his great head against my chest, while Sarah scratched under his chin. The rest of the herd gathered close, curious and calm. I ran my hand along the velvet of his new antlers, still growing soft and alive. "You held the line for all of us," I murmured. He huffed once warm breath against my neck, then turned to watch the tree line, ever vigilant, ever steady. Justice doesn't always thunder. Sometimes it arrives quietly, on a spring wind that smells of possibility. Sometimes it stands on four legs, antlers, wide against the sky, guarding what was never hers to take. And sometimes it walks beside you hand in hand, with the daughter who learned long before most adults do. That peace is worth defending. Spring fully claimed the land that year, turning the snowbanks into rushing streams and the paddocks into seas of fresh green. The air carried the sharp, sweet scent of new-growth pine sap warming in the sun. Damp earth waking up wildflowers, pushing through the thaw like quiet promises. Yukon's winter coat shed in thick tufts that Sarah gathered into baskets for local crafters. His new summer fur gleamed dark and sleek antlers, now fully hardened into sweeping crowns that caught the light like polished mahogany. He moved with the easy authority of a guardian who knew the war was over. We both felt the lightness settle into our bones. For the first time in years, chores weren't punctuated by glances toward the greenbelt. No more checking cameras at 3 a.m. No more tense silences over dinner wondering what fresh complaint might arrive in the mailbox. One May morning, Sarah came into the barn with an idea sparkling in her eyes. We should open the place up just once. Not a zoo or a show, something small. For people who need what the herd gave us. I leaned on the pitchfork, studying her. She'd grown taller this year, shoulders stronger from hauling hay, and holding lines I'd once thought only adults could hold. "Who do you have in mind?" "Veterans," she said without hesitation. "Kids who don't talk much. Families who've lost someone and need quiet more than words." We called it Herd and Heal a Day with Reindeer. Sarah designed simple flyers on her laptop, nothing flashy, just a photo of Yukon against the mountains and the words, "Come breathe." No crowds, no cost. 30 invitations only. We left them at the VFW Hall, the Veterans Clinic in town, the elementary school counselor's office. We didn't know if anyone would come. They did. On the first Sunday in June, vehicles rolled slowly down our gravel drive. Old pickups with veteran plates, minivans, with tired parents, a wheelchair van from the VA. 32 people in all, a few more than we'd planned, but we couldn't turn anyone away. There were no speeches. No guided tours with microphones. Just open gates, fresh coffee in thermoses, and the herd waiting in the main pasture. An older man in a faded desert storm cap stood motionless for 20 minutes, hand resting on Ash's neck, while tears tracked silently down weathered cheeks. A young mother sat on a hay bale with her nonverbal son, watching the reindeer graze while he leaned against her shoulders, finally relaxing. A teenage boy who'd lost his father overseas rested his forehead against Yukon's for so long the big bull closed his eyes in quiet communion. Sarah moved among them, like she'd been doing this forever, quiet words, gentle guidance, a hand on a shoulder when words failed. I poured coffee, refilled water troughs, and mostly stayed back letting the animals do what they did best, offer presents without demand. Near sunset, a nurse who'd served in Iraq found me by the fence. "You didn't just protect your land," she said, voice thick. "You protected something bigger. A place where people like us can remember how to be human again." I didn't have anything clever to say. I just nodded throat tight. The last visitor left as the sky turned rose and gold. Sarah and I stood on the porch watching taillights disappear down the drive. "We'll do it again," she said. Every year, I agreed. The court-ordered checks from Karen began arriving, monthly small mechanical deposits into an account I'd labeled the Fence Fund. I never spent a dime on myself. Instead, with James Calder's pro bono help, we turned it into seed money for a nonprofit legal aid for rural landowners facing HOA overreach. First case was a widow 2 counties over fighting to keep her horses. We won. Yukon became something of a quiet legend. Sarah ran an Instagram for him, simple photos, no commentary needed. Followers sent carrots, thank you notes, stories of their own battles won. He never posed. He simply existed majestic and unflinching, a reminder that dignity doesn't need words. The HOA never recovered its old swagger. The board shrank to 3 cautious members. Everett's house sold cheap. Buyers cited the peaceful Reindeer view in their offer letter. A new ordinance born from our case, and Denise Tran's courage put teeth in boundary protections across the county. One warm August evening, Sarah and I walked the perimeter at dusk. Fireflies rose from the grass like slow green stars. Yukon trailed behind us, hooves soft on the new growth. Sarah slipped her arm through mine. "What now, Dad?" I looked out over the land, our land, the pines dark against the last light, the herd settling for the night, the fence standing strong and silent. "We keep living," I said. "We keep protecting what's ours, and we let the rest take care of itself." She rested her head on my shoulder, and we stood there a long time, breathing in the scent of summer earth and freedom earned the hard way. When you've walked through war overseas, or in your own backyard, and come out the other side, you learn one truth that stays with you. Peace isn't handed down. It's guarded, sometimes with laws and cameras, sometimes with documentation and resolve, and sometimes with 500 pounds of quiet strength wearing antlers wide enough to cast a shadow no entitlement can cross. The snow would return eventually. The wind would howl again. But the ground beneath our boots was ours. The sky above us unbroken, and the herd led by a guardian bull named Yukon would always stand watch. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.